the emperor expressed a wish to go out, though the wind was extremely boisterous. We all walked to the extremity of the wood. He took a review of the governor's conduct, making remarks upon it in the rapid and copious way peculiar to himself. And he concluded by saying that if today we should agree to sign the declaration in order to avoid being separated from him, tomorrow another ground of expulsion would be brought forward, and that he should wish our removal to be effected forcibly and at once rather than tranquilly and in detail. Then suddenly assuming a tone of pleasantry, he said that after all he could hardly believe the governor wished to reduce his subjects to one only, and what sort of subject would that one be? Added he, an absolute porcupine on which he would find it impossible to lay a finger. During our walk, two strangers approached pretty near to us. The emperor made someone inquire who they were, and he was informed that they belonged to a vessel which was about to sail tomorrow for Europe. The emperor asked whether they were likely to see any of the ministers on their arrival in London. They replied that they should see Lord Bathurst. Tell him, said Napoleon, that his instructions with respect to my treatment here are most odious, and that his agent executes them with scrupulous fidelity. If he wished to get rid of me, he should have dispatched me at a blow instead of thus killing me by inches. This conduct is truly barbarous. There is nothing English in it, and I can only attribute it to some personal hatred. I have too much respect for the Prince Regent, the majority of the ministers, and the English nation to suppose they are responsible for my treatment. Be this as it may, their power extends only to my body. The soul is beyond their reach. It will soar to heaven, even from the dungeon. The emperor, on his return home, took a bath. He was fatigued and harassed by the events of the day. He fell asleep, and I watched beside him, meditating on our new grievances. At dinner, he ate but a little. Someone made an observation, and the emperor, not having heard it distinctly, asked what had been said, a thing which frequently happens. The words were then repeated in a louder tone, upon which he observed, I'm certainly growing deaf, for I occasionally miss hearing what is said, and I feel inclined to be angry when people speak louder than usual. He concluded the evening by reading a part of Don Quixote. He was much amused at some comic passages, and laying down the book, he remarked that we certainly showed a great deal of courage, since we could laugh at such trifles under our present circumstances. He paused for some moments and seemed deeply wrapped in thought. Then rising, he withdrew, saying, Adieu, my dear friends. During dinner, a letter had been delivered to me from the Grand Marshal, but I had kept it concealed, conceiving that it augured no good. I opened it as soon as the emperor withdrew. I enclosed a letter from the governor, announcing that if we still persisted in our refusal to sign the declaration, he would immediately give orders for our removal to Europe. We yielded to the dictates of our hearts. To determine on leaving the emperor was beyond our power, while at the same time it would have been going beyond his wishes, and perhaps too beyond his orders. With unanimous sentiments, we eagerly signed the declarations in the form in which they were presented to us, and delivered them to the English officer on duty at Longwood, together with a letter to the Grand Marshal, acquainting him with what we had done without his participation. We had been guided solely by our feelings, and we trusted that those feelings would afford us consolation, even though the emperor should disapprove of the step we had taken. We have now reached the consummation of our absolute slavery and dependence on the will and caprice of Sir Hudson Lowe, not merely by the signature we have just given him, but because he now knows our secret, and therefore it is in his power to compel us to submit to anything he pleases. The 16th, the emperor sent for me about noon. He had been reading and was just finishing his coffee. He desired me to sit down, and he entered into conversation. Not a word escaped him that could lead me to suppose he knew the determination we had adopted yesterday evening. He made no allusion to the subject, and it was not mentioned throughout the whole of the day. After breakfast, the emperor walked about his apartments. The turn of the conversation introduced some anecdotes of former times, of which Sieyès was the subject. The emperor related that while Sieyès was chaplain to the Prince of Orleans, being one day engaged in performing mass, something unexpectedly occasioned the prince to withdraw. during the service, upon which the abbé, looking up and seeing only the valets present, immediately closed his book, observing that he was not engaged to perform mass to the rabble. Your Majesty, said I, was the first who made me acquainted with the name and person of Sieyès. A few days after my presentation at court, your Majesty, at one of your audiences, having passed by me, stopped to speak to the person who stood next to me, addressing him by name. All my emigrant prejudices were yet in full force, and I thought myself polluted by coming in contact with one whom I regarded as an absolute monster, and whom I had never heard mentioned except as an object of the bitterest imprecation. Doubtless, said the Emperor, you were thinking of the more sans phrase, but I have heard it affirmed that Sieyès denied that. I now repeated an anecdote which used to be circulated in the Faubourg Saint-Germain, and on which, the first time I related it, the Emperor made no observation. Sieyès was described as having used the epithet tyrant in speaking of Louis XVI, to which Napoleon was said to have replied, Monsieur Abbé, if he had been a tyrant, I should not be here, and you would still be performing mass. I might have thought so, said the Emperor, on my relating this anecdote for the second time, but I should certainly not have been fool enough to say so. This is one of the absurd stories invented in the drawing rooms of Paris. I never committed blunders of that kind. My object was to extinguish and not feed the flame. The torrent of hostility was already too forcibly directed against certain leaders of the revolution. I found it necessary to support and countenance them, and I did so, someone having procured, God knows where, a bust of Sieyès. In his ecclesiastical character, it was publicly exhibited and occasioned a universal uproar. Sieyès, in a furious passion, set out to make a complaint to me, but I had already given the necessary reprimand, and the bust was again consigned to obscurity. My great principle was to guard against reaction and to bury the past in oblivion. I never condemned any opinion or prescribed any act. I was surrounded by men who had voted for the death of Louis XVI. They were in the ministry and in the Council of State. I did not approve of their doctrines, but what had I to do with them? What right had I to constitute myself as their judge? Some had been actuated by conviction, others by weakness and terror, and all by the delirium and fury of the moment. The fatality of the Greek tragedy was exemplified in the life of Louis XVI. I told the Emperor that it was reported in the Faubourg Saint-Germain that Sieyès had been detected in a conspiracy against him in the affair of Monsieur Clément de Brie, and that Napoleon had pardoned him on condition of his entirely withdrawing himself from any participation in political affairs. This is another idle story for which there is not the slightest foundation, said the Emperor. Sieyès was always attached to me, and I never had any cause to complain of him. He was probably vexed to find that I opposed his metaphysical ideas, but he was at length convinced that it was necessary for France to have a ruler, and he preferred me to any other. Sieyès was, after all, an honest and a very clever man. He did much for the revolution. The Emperor mentioned that at one of the first public festivals that took place during the consulate, as he was viewing the illuminations in company with Sieyès, he asked him what he thought of the state of affairs. Sieyès replied in a cold and even disheartening tone. And yet, resumed Napoleon, I had this morning very satisfactory proofs of the spirit of the people. It is seldom, replied Sieyès, that the people show their real spirit when the man who is possessed of power presents himself to their gaze. I can assure you they are far from being satisfied. Then you do not think the present government firmly established? No. And when do you suppose we shall be settled? When I see the dukes and marquises of the old court in your antechamber. Sieyès, added the Emperor, little dreamed that this would so soon be the case. He was short-sighted and could not see very far before him. I thought, as he did, that all could not end with the Republic, but I foresaw the establishment of the Empire. Accordingly, 2 or 3 years afterwards, the circumstance I have just related being still fresh in my recollection, I said to Sieyès at one of my grand audiences, well, you're now pell-mell with all the old dukes and marquises. Do you think all is settled now? Oh, yes, replied Sieyès, bowing profoundly. You have accomplished miracles which were never before equaled and which I never could have foreseen. During the consulate and even during the empire, Napoleon used at public festivals to go out late at night for the purpose of seeing the shows and hearing the sentiments of the people. He once went out in this way, accompanied by Maria Louisa, and they both walked arm in arm on the boulevards, highly amused at seeing their majesties, the emperor and empress, and all the grandees of the court represented in the magic lanterns. During the consulate, Napoleon was standing in front of the Hotel de la Marine, viewing a public illumination. Besides him was a lady, to all appearance, had formerly moved in a distinguished sphere, accompanied by her daughter, a very pretty girl, to whom she was pointing out all the persons of note as they passed to and fro in the apartments. Calling her daughter's attention to a certain individual, she said, "Remind me to go and pay my respects to him someday. We ought to do so, but he has rendered us a great service." "But, mother," replied the young lady, "I did not know that we were expected to show gratitude to such people. I thought they were too happy in being able to oblige persons of our quality." "Certainly," said the Emperor, "La Bruyere would have turned this incident to good account." Napoleon sometimes went out in disguise early in the morning, traversing the streets of the capital alone and mingling with the laboring classes of the people, with whose condition and sentiments he wished to make himself acquainted. In the Council of State, I have often heard him advise the prefect of police to adopt this plan. He called it the Caliph system of police, and said he esteemed it to be the best. On his return from the disastrous campaigns of Moscow and Leipzig, Napoleon, in order to maintain the appearance of confidence, frequently appeared amidst the multitude with scarcely any attendants. He visited the marketplaces and faubourgs and all the populous districts of the capital, conversing familiarly with the people, and he was everywhere received and treated with respect. One day at La Halle, a woman with whom he had been holding a little dialogue bluntly told him he ought to make peace. "Good woman," replied the emperor, "sell your herbs and leave me to settle my affairs. Let everyone attend to his own calling." The bystanders laughed and applauded him. On another occasion, at the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, when surrounded by an immense concourse of people whom he was treating very condescendingly, someone asked whether affairs were really as bad as they were represented to be. "Why, certainly," replied the emperor, "I cannot say that things are going on very well, but what will be the end of this? Heaven knows! Will the enemy enter France? Very possibly, and he may even march to Paris. If you do not assist me, I have not a million of arms. I cannot do all by my own individual efforts." "We will support you," exclaimed a number of voices. "Then I shall beat the enemy and preserve the glory of France." "But what must we do?" "You must enlist and fight." "We will," said one of the crowd. "But we must make a few conditions." "What are they?" "We will not pass the frontier." "You shall not be required to do so." "We wish to serve in the guards," said another. "You shall do so." The air instantly resounded with acclamation. Registers were immediately opened, and 2,000 men enlisted in the course of the day. Napoleon returned to the Tuileries, and as he entered the Place Carrousel on horseback, surrounded by the multitude whose acclamations rent the air, it was supposed that an insurrection had broken out, and the gates were about to be closed. On his return from the island of Elba, the emperor made another visit to the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, where he was received with equal enthusiasm and conducted back to the palace in a similar manner. As he passed through the Faubourg Saint-Germain, the multitude who escorted him halted before the principal hotels and manifested their disapprobation by angry words and gestures. The emperor observed that he had scarcely ever been placed in so delicate a situation. How many evils might have ensued, said he, had a single stone been thrown by the mob, had a single imprudent word or even an equivocal look escaped me. The whole Faubourg might have been destroyed, and I am convinced that its preservation was to be attributed wholly to my presence of mind and the respect which the multitude entertained for me. Today I attended the emperor's toilet. Santini was cutting his hair, and a large tuft fell at my feet. I stooped to pick it up, and the emperor, observing me, asked what I was doing. I replied that I had dropped something, upon which he smiled and pinched my ear. He guessed what I picked up. Speaking of the depravity and corruption of manners which prevailed at the time when he commanded the army of the interior in Paris, Napoleon mentioned that an ordinateur came to solicit some signatures from him and begged that he would give his support to certain appointments and supplies, as he promised to do without hesitation. Conceiving that there was nothing unfair in the proposal, before he withdrew, the ordinateur dexterously took an opportunity of leaving on the chimney piece 2 rouleaux containing 100 louis. This was an enormous sum in specie, for at that time paper money was chiefly in use. Fortunately, the general was the first to discover the circumstance, and the visitor was called back before he had gone far. He at first attempted to deny having left the money, but he afterwards acknowledged it, observing that everyone must live, and that the method he had adopted was, he believed, the general one. He, however, hoped that he might be forgiven if he had unintentionally done wrong, adding that it was very seldom necessary to ask pardon for such offenses. At the hour at which the emperor generally takes his walk, he found himself very drowsy, but he was determined to rouse himself when he went out through the wind, even though it was blowing violently. After walking a short way, he returned to the house, and we entered Madame de Montsont's apartment. The emperor had no sooner seated himself on the sofa than he felt inclined to fall asleep. He rose and proceeded to the drawing room. He complained of great internal heat, and he asked for a glass of toast and water. His drowsiness still continued, and he retired to his chamber to lie down. About 7 o'clock, he sent for me and gave me the following note, which he desired me to keep along with the rest of the official papers. It was the copy of a note which he had sent that morning to the governor. I recollect that in a conversation which took place between General Lowe and some of the gentlemen of my suite, alluding to the conversation of the 15th, some observations were made respecting my situation which were not conformable with my ideas. I abdicated to the representatives of the people in favor of my son. I proceeded with confidence to England with the intention of living there or in America in profound retirement, and under the name of a colonel who was killed in battle by my side. I had resolved to remain a stranger to all political affairs of any kind whatever. When I went on board the Northumberland, I was informed that I was a prisoner of war, that I was to be transported beyond the line, and that I was to be called General Bonaparte. This obliged me to retain ostensibly the title of Emperor Napoleon, in opposition to the name of General Bonaparte, which it was wished should be forced upon me. About 7 or 8 months ago, Count Montsalon proposed to obviate the little difficulties that are continually arising by my adopting an ordinary name. The admiral thought it necessary to write to London on this subject, and there the matter rested. The name which is now applied to me has the advantage of not prejudging the past, but it is not in unison with the forms of society. I'm still disposed to assume a name that may be conformable with custom. I once more repeat that whenever I may be released from my cruel captivity, I am still willing to continue a stranger to all political affairs, whatever may take place in the world. Such is my determination, and no other declaration on this subject has my sanction. The emperor ate but little dinner. There was something very extraordinary in the lethargy that had come over him. He had been overpowered by drowsiness during the whole of the day, and yet when he withdrew, he said he was afraid he should not sleep. His sensations were so extraordinary. He generally rests soundly when he is inclined to sleep, but he had been dozing all day long without being able to get any rest. Today, a frigate sailed for Europe.